So let's hear from our guest speaker, David Cronin, and you're very welcome to Brighton indeed. David's a journalist and political activist, originally from Ireland and currently living in Brussels, although not currently, for the past 22 years, he tells me, living in Brussels. He's an associate editor of the Electronic Intifada, which of course many of us use to get the kind of news and analysis that's desperately lacking from the mainstream British media. And many of us have greatly benefited from David's contributions to Electronic Intifada for the clarity of their analysis and for the political commitment that drives them. David also contributes to The Economist and to The Guardian's Comment is Free site and a number of other places as well. One of David's many claims to fame was that at a press conference at the EU in Brussels in 2011, he attempted to make a citizen's arrest of Avigdor Lieberman. Lieberman, the extreme right-wing Israeli politician and apologist for apartheid, if not an actual war criminal. David was reported to have been restrained by security guards and escorted from the building shouting, "Free Palestine." Actually, he tells me tonight that he also attempted to make a citizen's arrest of Tony Blair. It just gets better and better. Of course, after the attempted citizen's arrest of Lieberman, the Zionist blogosphere just went bananas and questioned his right to be called a journalist. But I think I'm right in saying that he's a proper journalist as far as we're concerned, and very welcome indeed here tonight. Before writing his current book on Balfour, David authored two previous books, Europe's Alliance with Israel, Aiding the Occupation, published by Pluto in 2011, and Corporate Europe, How Big Business Sets Policies on Food, Climate and War, also published by Pluto in 2013. But David's most recent book is Balfour's Shadow, A Century of British Support for Zionism in Israel, published this year by Pluto. As you'll have seen, David's brought copies of the book with him tonight, and he'll be signing copies at the end of the meeting for anyone who's interested. So it's that book that will inform David's talk tonight, Justice for Palestine, 100 years after Balfour, Israel's Crimes, Britain's Complicity. David.
Good evening. Thanks very much for coming along. Thanks for inviting me here to Brighton. My first time in Brighton, so I very much enjoyed the stay. Thanks very much to Barry and to Dorothy and Anne in particular for their hospitality. And just before I get out to the main business of the evening, just like to apologise in advance if I have a little bit of a cold, so if I have any Theresa May's style coffee, please understand.
Strong and stable.
What's that?
Strong and stable.
Strong and stable, exactly. Yeah, not too strong and stable this evening, but I'll do my best. My friends, during the summer, I visited the birthplace of Arthur James Balfour in East Lothian, Scotland. And next to his family's home, there is a little church with a plaque dedicated to Balfour on its rear wall. And according to that plaque, Balfour was a man who, and I quote, advanced truth, righteousness and peace in the world. That rosy tribute is at complete variance with the legacy of dispossession that Balfour bequeathed to Palestine. Then, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Balfour signed a pledge to support the key objectives of the Zionist movement in November 1917. The Balfour Declaration, as that pledge became known, was phrased awkwardly and ambiguously, nonetheless, its intention could not be concealed. Through that document, Britain became the imperial sponsor of a Jewish state, or a Jewish national home, as it was called euphemistically, that would be established in Palestine by expelling its indigenous people en masse. It is true that the Balfour Declaration contained some assurances about avoiding harm to Palestinian rights, yet ultimately those assurances proved hollow. As Balfour himself would remark in 1919, so just 2 years after his famous declaration, Britain regarded Zionist aspirations to be of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. The colonization of Palestine was something of an anomaly in this period. Endorsed by the American President Woodrow Wilson, the whole concept of self-determination was gaining wider currency. Chaim Weizmann, a Manchester-based scientist and a leading figure in the British Zionist movement, lobbied for the principle of self-determination to be rejected in the case of the Palestinians. And unfortunately, his efforts and the efforts of other leading Zionists proved successful. As a result, the League of Nations mandate, under which Britain ruled Palestine between the two world wars, contained an explicit commitment to nurture Zionist colonization. The Balfour Declaration was, in effect, copied and pasted into that mandate. Before long, Britain's support for Zionism had a discernible impact. Herbert Samuel became the first British High Commissioner for Palestine in 1920. Herbert Samuel was himself a staunch Zionist, and he introduced a series of measures to finance and facilitate the taking over by European settlers of land on which Palestinians had lived and farmed for generations. Understandably, many Palestinians resisted the evictions and the discrimination they encountered, and Britain responded to that resistance in a frequently brutal manner. Faced with unrest in the early 1920s, a man named Winston Churchill, who of course was Britain's colonial secretary at the time, recommended that a so-called picked force of white gendarmerie should be formed for Palestine. This force would be comprised of men who had previously served in the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. The Black and Tans and the auxiliaries were Crown forces based in Ireland during its War of Independence. As you probably know, the Black and Tans got their name simply because of the colour of their uniforms. Now, learning that these forces had in effect been sent from Ireland to Palestine was something that both disturbed and fascinated me. I grew up in a town called Balbriggan in County Dublin that was largely burnt down by British forces in September 1920. The sack of Balbriggan, as that incident became known, prompted a debate in Westminster about whether British forces lacked discipline. During that same month, September 1920, my great-granduncle, Patrick Hartnett, was shot dead by the Black and Tans in another part of Ireland. Patrick Hartnett was a postman in the Limerick area. He had no known involvement in the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and he was doing nothing more sinister than walking along a country road one morning when he was ambushed and shot dead by the Black and Tans. And while I was researching my book, I found a 1938 Colonial Office document urging that Black and Tan methods should be avoided in Palestine. That appeal came a little bit late, to put it very mildly. Britain had been using ruthless Black and Tan type methods in Palestine for almost 2 decades at that point. A man named Douglas Duff served with the Black and Tans in the Galway area before heading for Palestine as part of the gendarmerie established on Winston Churchill's initiative. Douglas Duff was an overt racist who wrote about encountering what he called lesser breeds in the Middle East. And Duff rose through the ranks of the British forces to become a police inspector for the Jerusalem area. Douglas Duff has been immortalised in the phrase "duffing up," a euphemism for torture, and his memoirs indicate that he may have been a pioneer of that odious practice we now call waterboarding. In the year 1929, riots broke out in Jerusalem over how Zionist settlers encroached into Muslim parts of the old city, something that of course is still happening today in 2017. And Britain responded to those riots by killing and maiming large numbers of people. These riots were by no means isolated. Similar disturbances, to use the British term, occurred in many parts of Palestine. Now, it's true the British acknowledged in official documentation and official reports that Zionist colonisation was leading to the mass eviction of Palestinians from the land on which they lived and farmed. Despite acknowledging this problem, the British exacerbated it. The British authorities continued facilitating the development of Zionist colonies, even approving plans for supplying them with weapons. During the 1930s, a major Palestinian revolt erupted. And soon after this rebellion broke out, the British authorities demolished the old city of Jaffa, leaving its inhabitants homeless. This was one of many instances in which entire communities were penalised collectively for refusing to obey their oppressors. Roughly 5,000 Palestinians were killed between 1936 and 1939. Relative to population size, that was a higher casualty rate than the casualty rates caused by Israel during the two intifadas which broke out in 1987 and the year 2000, respectively. State archives, British state archives, even refer to how Britain established a concentration camp near Sarafand al-Amar, a village on Palestine's coastal plain. And I hasten to add that it was the British themselves who referred to this facility as a concentration camp. The concentration camp was used to intern men accused of involvement in the Palestinian revolt. As part of their efforts to crush this revolt, the British hired members of the Haganah, the largest Zionist militia in Palestine at that time, and a forerunner of today's Israeli military. One particular British soldier, a man named Ord Wingate, brought commanders of the Haganah into the so-called Special Night Squads that he led. They were called the Special Night Squads simply because they operated under the cover of darkness. Ord Wingate approved acts of extreme cruelty. His troops gained a reputation for rounding up all the men who lived near an oil pipeline connecting Iraq and Palestine, then ordering that these men strip and whipping their naked torsos. The result of Britain's collaboration with the Haganah was that many of the Zionist forces responsible for driving around 750,000 Palestinians from their home the following decade, the 1940s, had received British training. This means that Britain laid the groundwork for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Palestinians, of course, refer to the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine as the Nakba, as most if not all of you probably know. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. This particular catastrophe was entirely man-made. During the 1940s, the British came to the conclusion that their mandate for Palestine could no longer be sustained. Although the British were to relinquish the mandate in May 1948, they were still in charge when the Nakba began. This means that Britain was under a legal and moral obligation to protect Palestinians from harm. That obligation was reneged on. For the most part, Britain took a hands-off approach as Zionist forces attacked and, in some cases, massacred Palestinians. Hugh Stockwell was a British military general based in the Haifa area of Palestine, and his papers show that he knew in advance that Zionist forces were planning what he called a major offensive in that area. Stockwell ordered his troops not to intervene, but rather to let Zionist and Arab forces, in his words, fight it out. This order overlooked how Zionist forces were numerically stronger and equipped with much more lethal weaponry than the Arab forces had. And after refusing to help Palestinians, Stockwell instructed them to leave Haifa. Such instructions arguably made Britain a direct accomplice in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, it's true that relations between Britain and the Zionist movement have sometimes been fractious. Two armed Zionist groups, the Irgun and the Lehi, came to regard Britain as a bitter enemy. These groups waged a campaign of guerrilla warfare, including famously some bombing raids and some assassinations against Britain and against British politicians and British diplomats during the 1940s. The British establishment was angry with the actions of these groups. Winston Churchill, despite how he was a staunch supporter of Zionism, went so far at one point to lament how the ideology had, in his words, created gangsters. Despite all of this, despite that fractious relationship, Britain has continued to embrace the Zionist project. Some British politicians have even argued that they are duty-bound to support Israel, given that Britain played a crucial role in the establishment of that state. Now, this does not mean that they necessarily romanticise Israel. On the contrary, British governments have tended to view Israel as a vehicle for advancing Western interests in the Middle East, even to do their dirty work. This was dramatically so in 1956, when Britain and France persuaded Israel to attack Egypt. Britain and France persuaded Israel to launch an attack on Israel because they were aggrieved by the Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and his decision to nationalise the Suez Canal, which of course was located on a key shipping route between Europe and India. This 1956 offensive involved Israeli massacres in Gaza. I read a number of books about the Suez Canal when I was doing my research for my own book, and many of these books do not even mention the Israeli massacres in Gaza. They have in effect been airbrushed out of history by many historians. In June 1967, Israel went to war against its neighbours, including Egypt, once more. Through that war, Israel began a military occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, which persists to this very day. The June 1967 war was enabled by Harold Wilson's government. It was enabled by the fact that Harold Wilson's government approved the delivery of hundreds of British battle tanks to Israel ahead of June 1967. And after the war, British diplomats in Tel Aviv were very pleased by feedback from Israeli generals about how these British battle tanks had performed much better than had been expected. Israel has provided a violent sense of continuity by basing its occupation on rules imposed by Britain when it was in direct charge of Palestine. Invoking such rules, it shall be stressed, does not in any way absolve Israel for its routine violations of international law. Britain's policies on the Middle East have been increasingly shaped by its key ally, by the United States, in recent decades. Ronald Reagan resorted to the kind of duplicity that subsequent American presidents have replicated. Reagan boosted military aid to Israel quite dramatically, while portraying Palestinians as the obstacle to peace. His ideological soulmate, Margaret Thatcher, echoed him by branding all armed resistance to Israel as terrorism. Thatcher was the first British president to undertake, the first British Prime Minister to undertake an official visit to Israel. And during her stay, she gushed about how Israeli democracy was flourishing. Tony Blair has been demonstrably worse. Despite harping on about justice and statehood for the Palestinians, Blair has proven to be a hardcore apologist for Israel. Blair entered Downing Street during a period when those invidious Oslo Accords were still relatively fresh, if that is the correct term. Those accords followed an agenda driven largely by Israel and the United States, which placed great emphasis on Israel's security in the narrow sense of that term. The Palestinian political leadership was required to be increasingly deferential towards Israel and respectful of Israel's sensitivities. The effects of such deference have been all too visible lately. Issa Amro, a human rights campaigner, has been locked up by the Palestinian Authority simply for writing on Facebook. Issa Amro wrote posts on Facebook that were critical of how the Palestinian Authority's forces had detained a radio station director from Issa's hometown of Hebron. This very same radio station had recently been raided and ordered closed by Israel. Fortunately, Issa Amro has since been released. I had the pleasure to meet him in Leeds a few weeks ago. I understand that he's since been in Brighton. He's a very gentle and a courageous man, and as well as being targeted by the Palestinian Authority, Issa Amro faces trial in an Israeli military court. It is very clear that Israel is trying to punish him because of his peaceful activities, particularly for his relentless and fearless campaigning against settlement activities in the Hebron area and elsewhere in the occupied West Bank. It is an absolute disgrace that the Palestinian Authority has joined Israel in persecuting somebody like Issa Amro. Sadly, however, it is not surprising. For a number of years, Israel and the Palestinian Authority have been behaving as partners in repression. And Britain has been a key supporter of so-called security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. From the Blair era onwards, Britain has been one of the largest contributors of both money and personnel to United States and European Union-led operations designed to boost cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The aim of these operations has been to train and to mentor Palestinian forces so as to behave as a kind of proxy for Israel. That is not simply my observation. Keith Dayton, the United States general, who served as a security coordinator in Palestine, has noted how quite a few Israeli troops stationed in the West Bank left their usual posts to join the massive Israeli attack against Gaza in late 2008 and early 2009. These guys were willing to leave their usual posts, according to Dayton, because they had gained enough confidence in the Palestinian Authority's forces that these forces would look after Israel's interests. The Palestinian Authority's forces did indeed look after Israel's interests. They did so by violently attacking fellow Palestinians who came out and demonstrated on the streets of the West Bank in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Gaza. Britain has enabled this violent repression of Palestinians. This has not gone unnoticed by the Americans. Keith Dayton has gone so far as to describe the British members of his team as his eyes and ears. Now, Tony Blair's endorsement, support for Israel's 2006 attack on Lebanon caused immense anger within the Labour Party and of course among the wider British public. But for some reason it did not stop Blair from being named as what British newspapers have called a peace envoy for the Middle East on the very same day, within hours of him stepping down as Prime Minister. Blair used that position, which he held until quite recently, to sanitize the medieval siege that Israel has imposed on Gaza. Israel refers to its propaganda activities as Hasbara, which of course is often translated as explaining. Tony Blair has proven to be quite a polished practitioner of Hasbara. On at least one occasion, he has gone on a kind of a diplomatic initiative to sell an Israeli plan for easing the siege of Gaza while essentially keeping the siege intact as a significant step forward. When Israel has bombarded Gaza, Blair has parroted the official excuse that Israel was behaving defensively. That, of course, was a brazen lie. And it was not the first time in Blair's career that he is told a brazen lie. Largely unnoticed by the mainstream media, the bonds between Israel and Britain's arms industries have increased considerably in recent times. That was confirmed by a senior figure from Elbit Systems, one of Israel's largest weapons companies, just a few weeks ago, when Elbit argued that it wishes to treat Britain as an actual home market. Elbit Systems is the parent company of at least 5 businesses in Britain, as well as being involved in what is called significant partnerships with the British arms industry. And Elbit was one of about 20 Israeli companies that took part in the large arms fair in London last month. Elbit also happens to be one of the two key providers of drones that have been used to bomb men, women and children in Gaza. Although that means that Elbit is profiting from crimes against humanity, it might also make this company attractive to Britain. Excuse me. The largest military drone program in Europe is called Watchkeeper, and it has been commissioned by the British Army. Watchkeeper is worth more than £1 billion, and it is based on Israeli-designed weapons. And the Israeli arms industry is involved in pretty much every stage of this project. As a result, there is a strong likelihood that the next time Britain goes to war, it will be doing so making use of weapons that have been tested out against children in Gaza. The last time such weapons were used in vast quantities against Gaza was, of course, during the summer of 2014. The British government fully supported that offensive. Philip Hammond, who, of course, has then gone on to higher things, but he was the Foreign Secretary at the time, has noted that he and his cabinet colleagues took a bit of flack, in his words, for their stance, and Hammond added, "We are proud of that." My friends, there is something very obscene going on here. The British government is proud to support offensives in which hundreds of Palestinian children are killed. And the same British government has the cheek to portray Palestine solidarity campaigners as extremists. For that, my friends, is precisely what is going on. We know that the British government has treated expressions of solidarity with the Palestinians as akin to support for violent extremism under PREVENT, that misleadingly named anti-terrorism programme. We know that British government ministers have invoked a bogus definition of anti-Semitism to try and halt robust criticisms of Israel being made by ordinary people in this country. We know that the Conservative Party has tried to stop local authorities in Britain from insisting that corporations investing in Israeli apartheid are excluded from pension funds and from contract bids. Nonetheless, my friends, there are reasons to be cheerful and to be hopeful. The main reason is that Britain has no shortage of decent people who are prepared to demand justice for the Palestinians, regardless of what their government ministers may say or do. Ordinary people in Britain have been particularly supportive of the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. This has not gone unnoticed by the Israeli government. One Israeli minister, a man named Gilad Erdan, has gone so far as to describe Britain as the world centre of the anti-Israel BDS campaign. Now, I suspect that Gilad Erdan did not intend it as such, but in my opinion that is a massive compliment to the good people of Britain. The BDS movement is unapologetically progressive. It opposes all forms of racial and religious bigotry, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It brings together Muslims, Jews, Christians and non-believers to demand that the injustices inflicted on the Palestinians must end. Theresa May has said that she is proud to support Israel and has claimed that it is absolutely right that Britain should celebrate the centenary of the Balfour Declaration in less than a month's time. Almost certainly, Britain, the British government, will use that occasion to hail Israel as a major success story. One cabinet minister, a man called Michael Gove, set the ball rolling at last week's Tory conference when he called Israel a truly miraculous nation and a light unto the world. My friends, let us send out a clear message to Michael Gove tonight. There is nothing miraculous, Mr. Gove, about how Palestinians were dispossessed at the stroke of Arthur Balfour's pen. There is nothing miraculous, Mr. Gove, about how Britain enabled the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And there is nothing miraculous about how a system of racial and religious discrimination was introduced by Britain and preserved by Israel. If Britain wishes to mark the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, it should not be doing so in a celebratory and a triumphalist fashion. Instead, Britain should be owning up to how it caused many of the injustices inflicted on the Palestinians. Theresa May and Michael Gove should not be proud of Britain's history in Palestine. They should be deeply ashamed. Thank you very much.